Hi, Andy with Camera Cravings. Hope you're all well. Today I've got another review for you, and it's the Sigma 150 to 600mm Canon lens, but it's the EF version mounted on the RF cameras, so the Canon R5 in this case. And I've been wanting to see what third-party lenses would be like on the RF mount cameras. For quite a while now, actually. I did a video which I will link somewhere up here on adapting Canon EF glass onto the RF cameras, and that's been a very popular video. So yeah, today I wanted to check out this big telephoto lens and compare it to some of the other lenses I've reviewed recently, including the RF 100-500 and also the RF 800mm. So yeah, that's coming right up. Okay, so before we get into the main body of the video, I just want to mention a couple of things. This is the sport version of the lens. There is a contemporary version of this lens which is significantly cheaper. I'll put the prices up on screen up here now. There are other differences that relate to the price differences. So one is the weight of the lens and the build quality and what it's made from, and the weather sealing of the lens as well, but it does make it quite a bit heavier, so it's about 1 kilo heavier than the contemporary lens. I'll talk about other handling features in a minute, but I just wanted to point that out. I did try and hire the contemporary, but hire a camera where I got it from didn't have the contemporary lens available, so I thought I'd want to try the sport anyway. Some people have said that the sport is sharper, other people have said the contemporary is sharper. From what I've seen, there isn't much in it. And they're both f5 to 6.3. You can also use both versions of this lens with their USB dock, and I haven't done that, but my understanding is you can adjust kind of autofocus settings, and you can do firmware updates and things like that, and yeah, adjust the stabilisation, how the stabilisation works in the lenses and things like that as well. On the lens you have the usual buttons you'd expect to find. There's a switch for manual or autofocus, which also has a middle switch for manual override. Below that you have a focus limiter switch, allowing you to focus between 2.5 and 10 meters, 10 meters to infinity or just full. I left it in full most of the time. Below that you have the optical stabilisation for the lens. You can set this to off, mode 1 or mode 2, with mode 1 being good for most situations and mode 2 being better for if you are tracking and panning shots of specific subjects like motorsport or birds in flight. Below that you have a additional switch which is for custom settings, C1 and C2, and this can be used in conjunction with the dock from Sigma, which allows you to customize the setup of the autofocus and various other aspects of the lens, the optical stabilization, things like that. Further down the barrel of the lens you have a lock switch which can be set to lock the lens in place at 150mm or at 600mm, which is useful to have, and stops the lens extending if you're carrying it vertically, for example. On top of the barrel is a focus window that shows the focus distances, and then you have two large rubberized focus and zoom rings. Now I found that this lens was quite stiff when zooming in and out. They do also allow you to zoom in and out using the front element of the lens, so you can literally pull it in and out, which some people prefer to do, and actually I found probably a bit easier on this lens compared to zooming the traditional way. The tripod collar on the lens is adjustable at stops of 90 degrees, and you can also remove the large foot to make it more compact if you wish. Unfortunately the whole collar is not removable. Build quality of this sport version of the lens is excellent, and it has a largely metal construction with high quality rubberized touch points and a rubberized gasket at the rear of the lens for extra weather sealing. I wouldn't have an issue taking this out in the rain, and it comes with a large metal hood as well, which kind of screws on rather than like normal hoods. A lot of them sort of click into place. This one actually has a little thumb screw that you kind of slip the whole hood over and then screw in, which I actually didn't really like. I preferred you know, the standard kind of tulip style kind of click in lens hoods. The front of the lens also has a rubberized bit, so if you put it down without the hood on, it protects the lens as well. Yeah, overall you could seriously punish this lens and it would be fine, I think. So this lens can be used with Sigma's 1.4x teleconverter, which gives you an extended range of 210 to 840 millimeters and makes the lens an f7.1 to f9 aperture range. I wanted to see how this affected the lens's performance when adapted onto the RF mount cameras, and on the R5 I found there was little to no effect in terms of either degradation of image quality or autofocus performance and speed. It's in this clip that I recorded through my Ninja 5 that I'm taking pictures of my cat, and the eye autofocus and tracking still works even with the teleconverter attached, which I was actually quite surprised by. The speed of autofocus acquisition didn't seem to really change much either. One thing to note is that I was shooting with the teleconverter on when the camera was almost out of battery, and it didn't seem to affect the performance at all, which was great to see. I did notice there was a slight loss of contrast with the images shot using the teleconverter, but other than that there didn't seem to be much change in image quality, and overall I was very impressed with how the camera, lens and teleconverter setup worked with the R5. My assumption is that this would be the same on an R6 as well, although I haven't tested that yet. This is potentially a great option for someone buying this lens because you can actually buy a package with the teleconverter for not that much more money than the actual lens itself, and it just gives you that extra flexibility when you want a bit of extra reach. If you were to use crop mode on the R5 in conjunction with the teleconverter, you would actually be able to achieve 1344 millimeters of reach, which is pretty impressive. So stabilisation in this lens is okay, it's not the best, but combined with the R5 in body stabilisation it does a pretty good job, particularly when you're zoomed right out at 600 millimeters. It makes a big difference, as you'll see from these clips here. As I discussed earlier, you can tweak the stabilisation settings to improve things within the Sigma dock and the app, but overall the combined lens and camera stabilisation do a decent job both for stills and video. However, you will not be getting the same standard of stabilisation as a Canon native lens like the RF 100 to 500 for example. So moving on to autofocus, I'm not going to talk about how this lens focuses on DSLR cameras because I think that is a completely different subject, but on the Canon R5, and I would assume the same could be said for the R6 because they have a very similar, if not exactly the same focusing system, it was fast to focus and in the main very accurate as well. The tracking worked really nicely, and that includes IAF and face tracking, both for people and also animals. As you can see, it tracked my son's eye here and also tracked the cat's faces and eyes pretty well. The biggest downside I would say with this lens is the minimum focusing distance, which because of its focal range is significant, and I did find there was a couple of times when things were either too close to focus on, or for example my cat walking towards me quickly went out of focus because he came towards me within that minimum focusing distance. So definitely something to be aware of. That minimum focusing distance is 2.6 meters or about 8.5 feet. So compare that to, for example, the Canon RF 1 to 500, which I tested fairly recently. That has a minimum focusing distance of about 1.2 meters or about 3.5 feet. So that's definitely something to be aware of and consider when you're looking at what you're going to use this lens for. If, for example, you're looking at birds in flight or animals, wildlife, things that are going to be running towards you, that are going to get close to you, maybe this isn't the lens for you. But obviously if you're looking at things that are going to be out in the distance, because you're going for a 600mm lens, then you shouldn't have a problem with it. Should be noted that the contemporary version of this lens I think has an even greater minimum focusing distance of about 2.8 meters, so slightly more. I found the lens pretty quiet to focus. It's not silent, but I was quite impressed with how quiet it was given the amount of elements it's moving in this big heavy lens, and as I'll talk about later, it can be used for video You'll notice in these clips shot through my Ninja 5 that the focusing box does not go to the extremes of the frame. It's probably about 75%, maybe 80% of the frame. So it's not going to be as good as some of the native lenses in that respect, but I was still quite impressed with how well it focused and how well it tracked to the extremities of the frame. It's certainly better than Canon's 600 and 800mm f11 lenses, which are restricted to the center part of the frame, as you'll see from this clip from me testing the 800mm. Unfortunately, during my testing with this lens I didn't have a chance to track birds in flight with it. However, I think it could be used for this purpose quite easily based on what I've seen. So jumping straight into Lightroom to have a look at image quality. This is a semi-macro shot I took of some flowers, and as you can see, when I put on the profile corrections for this lens, you notice that there is some distortion and also a reasonable amount of vignetting around the edges of the frame, and this is shot at 600mm. If I show you these two images, the same can be said at 150mm. There's still some distortion and vignetting. But obviously these corrections are easy to do in Lightroom or other software, and actually when we zoom in on these images, the quality and the sharpness is very good. With these long lenses there's a lot of factors in play, particularly when you're out at the long end. I found, for example, that when I was taking images down by the water on a hazy summer's day, the natural climatic elements played a bigger part in how sharp the image looked than the actual lens itself. For example, this image, you can see the haze in the distance there, and this boat is also moving at a fair speed and I'm panning, so there's a lot of variables that go into what your images will turn out like. I found that this lens seemed to be pretty sharp throughout the zoom range. This image is shot at 270mm, so about halfway through the zoom range, and as you can see by the texture on the brickwork of this church, there's an overall high quality to the image and sharpness to the image. It may not be up to the standards of some of the Canon native lenses, but it's not far off. Another thing to note is the shallow depth of field that's created with this lens, even at 150mm. So this Canon, for example, as you can see when I zoom in, not that much of it is in complete focus, but the parts that are very sharp and clear and crisp. The out of focus areas are decent, if not phenomenal. The bokeh balls in the background of this image, for example, are very rounded, and I would say almost as good as some of the Canon lenses I've tested. And similarly, in this image of the crabs, the fall off from the in focus area to the out of focus area is quite pleasing. I did find that sharpness dropped off a bit in the corners of the image, and also contrast was slightly lacking in the corners of the images. And overall I found this lens probably needed a little more contrast in post than, say, the Canon 100-500. Moving on to chromatic aberration, I actually found it quite hard to find images that I'd taken that showed chromatic aberration at all. In this one of this Porsche, you can see if I zoom in, there is some chromatic aberration around the number plate, but again, it's easily rectified by Lightroom. And to be honest, it's actually quite hard to see unless you zoom right in. If we go into 200%, you can actually see what I'm talking about. There's a little bit of green and purple fringing there. But yeah, to be honest, it's very limited and easy to remove. Long telephoto lenses don't like bright lights, and as with many other lenses in this category, when the sun or bright lights come into the frame, you will notice a lot of flaring. The good news is, as the light source is out of frame, the flaring disappears. I think in terms of overall image quality, I've been really quite impressed with this lens. The conditions I shot in weren't ideal, because I only had this lens for a few days, and as I've talked about, climatic conditions and the angle of the light, for example in this scene, would have more of an impact on your image quality than the actual lens itself. But I think it did a pretty good job of dealing with harsh sunlight and shooting straight into the sun as well. So overall, I think this lens performs very well, and particularly for the price point. Because of the weight of this lens, you're going to always get best results when mounted on a tripod, and it should be noted that all of the shots I've shown you today were shot handheld, so I wanted to give you the worst case scenario for image quality. Now, I didn't shoot a huge amount of video with this lens, but the video I did shoot I was fairly impressed with. Stabilisation, as I've talked about, was pretty good, even at the long end, as was the autofocus. It managed to track moving subjects well, and obviously within the Canon R5 you can adjust the autofocus speed settings in video mode, which you may wish to do, as I did find that it kind of jumped about a little bit on closer subjects. But yeah, overall worked well. There was limited noise from the autofocusing motors, certainly not enough that it would put me off using it for video. And if you had it on a tripod, it would be even better. All of these shots are obviously taken handheld. But yeah, this is what I'm talking about with the slight hunting for focus on closer subjects. And there was limited focus breathing as well, so certainly something to consider if you do video of wildlife or other subjects as well as your photography. Yeah, overall really quite impressed with how this worked in video mode on the R5. Okay, so as you can tell, I've been pretty impressed by the quality and performance of this lens when attached to the Canon R5, and I'd imagine it would be very similar in terms of performance and quality on the Canon R6. There's a couple of things I want to talk about. If you're thinking about buying this lens and adapting it onto the RF cameras, the R5 and R6 obviously are an upgrade compared to the R and RP in terms of their autofocusing system, so I wouldn't take this review as read that it would be the same on those cameras. I think you'd need to hire the lens for yourself and test it on those cameras, or hopefully there may be reviews out there testing it with the Canon R. The other things to mention are the kind of price comparison versus other lenses. So the contemporary version of this lens is a fair bit cheaper. It's going to be almost as good in terms of quality and performance, but obviously you don't get that extra build quality and weather sealing. So it really depends what you're looking for from this lens. Similarly, if you're looking for a lens that you're going to travel with, or a lens that you're going to hand hold most of the time, this lens isn't going to be the one for you unless you're incredibly strong, because I found it very tiring holding this lens for long periods of time, and I would definitely recommend having it on a tripod and kind of Wembley gimbal type setup. The other lenses that are available on the market at the moment for the RF system, obviously the RF 1 to 500, which is a Canon native lens, and I'll link a video that I did on that lens in the description below and somewhere up here. I thought that lens was outstanding, but you are paying a premium for it. It's almost £3,000 I think in the UK at the moment. So for half the cost you can get this Sigma lens, but it is twice the weight, more than twice the weight actually. Other alternatives available are obviously the older EF Canon 1 to 400 lens with a teleconverter. Would get you a similar reach. That could be an option for you. Or other third-party lenses, the Tamron 150-600 G2, which I have seen a couple of reviews with the Canon R6, and it seems to do pretty well, but it seems from those reviews that the autofocus on that lens is slightly less consistent maybe than the Sigma one. I found the Sigma one was generally pretty consistent, albeit the eye autofocus sometimes kind of wasn't as sticky and certainly not as good as obviously native Canon lenses. And then the other options, obviously the Canon 800mm and 600mm f11 lenses. Having tested the f11 800mm lens, I would say that that is a great lens, but you are limited with the autofocus box, as I've talked about, being in the central kind of portion of the frame. You're also limited by that f11. So yeah, it really comes down to what your budget is, whether you can afford to stretch to the RF 100 to 500, whether you want extra reach. The other thing that I have talked about and is a big deal for me personally is the 1 to 500. You can focus to 0.9 meters at the short end and 1.2 meters at the long end, whereas this lens, the minimum focusing distance is well over double that. So that's definitely something to consider, depending on the subjects you're going to be photographing and what you're going to be using this for. I think as an all-around package, the 100 to 500 is preferable, but obviously you're paying a huge premium for it. So yeah, I hope you found that helpful and you've got something out of the video. If you have, please do leave a like below and comment with any questions you have about this lens or other third-party lenses adapting onto RF system. And yeah, I will look forward to seeing you next time.